everyone. Thank you so much for attending our office hours session today, where we will be covering everything you need to know about forecasting. My name is Valerie, and I am on the product marketing team here at Assembled. And if you can go to the next slide, Adrian. Some of you actually may know me from my days in customer success, so it's really great to see a number of familiar faces here. I'll pass it on to my co-host Adrian to give an intro on himself as well.
Thanks, Val. Some of you may have seen me from previous webinars or seen my name around. I was actually previously on the product marketing team, overlapping with Val there for a little bit. And I've now moved to the workforce solutions team, which is a pretty recent change, but super excited to be here to interact and go over some forecasting thoughts with everybody. Forecasting, our agenda is going to cover what is forecasting, why is it important, good to set the tone, a couple of the different forecasting methods that we can go through with your short-term forecasting, very applicable to a lot of companies as they're getting started up, and how to make their tactical plans. And then maybe some of the special event forecasting, what happens when things are going to be a little bit outside of the norm, and how do you make some adjustments for that? And then, of course, as all good workforce managers know they should do, is we review our work and we make changes and updates into the future. What is forecasting? The topic of the day. So forecasting, specifically what we're talking about here is forecasting your volume, is what I consider to be the backbone of the successful WFM process. It is truly what you build off of for every other function that you're going to be doing. At the core, it's taking your historical data and combining it with what you think is going to happen in the future. Nothing truly out of the ordinary there. It's what we all know with forecasting, but I think an important part that sometimes gets forgotten is that this is not a set it or forget it exercise, set it and forget it. You need to be adjusting these forecasts pretty regularly, and then also going back and checking your work. Most of us all work in a pretty fast moving environment where things may change month over month, or even week over week, or day over day. And if you're not constantly going back, taking a look at that and incorporating it in, you're not going to catch those current trends and be able to adjust to those. So let's jump into the first part here, because this is usually pretty applicable to when you're starting up your business, when you're starting up your support team. You need to know, how can I kind of execute into the short term? What am I going to expect over maybe the next week to a few weeks, maybe a couple months, and really how can I execute against that? So short-term forecasting, as the name implies here, nothing creative about the name. It's the more immediate forecasting method. It's used for that tactical time frame, and maybe about 3 months out. The shorter you do that out, maybe the faster you'll be able to adjust to it, but the longer out you can give that tactical forecast, even if you do have to go back and change it, the more it gives people a heads up, and more it gives you a chance to plan against it versus kind of scrambling in the last minutes here. So let's jump into a couple of the common forecasting methods. This by no means covers every way to do forecasting, and we are not going to go into the technical mathematical deep dives of how to do these models, but it's a good place to start off. There are definitely many, many ways to go about this, and it can go way down the rabbit hole with complication here. But a few of the common forecasting methods here is just your running average methodology. It's a pretty effective technique, is to just take your running averages over the last few weeks and just use that to forecast your upcoming ones. This is something that, with the Assembled tool, it can aggregate and eat all of that data for you and spit out that forecast. And actually, a majority of our customers do use that forecast methodology to get a variance of 10% or lower with just that single data point. That is a pretty good variance, and something that people are able to model against and staff against pretty well. Your next step here is, if you want to take it just a little bit further, you might go into a momentum model. So now you've gotten your running averages, you're kind of looking at how volume's been coming in, but you want to take, instead of just doing the pure average, and start to figure out what is your growth rate week over week. Just looking at your volume changes and kind of applying that forward. So it's really the next iterative step in these models here. And then the last one here, we won't touch on it here, but is when you use regression models, or maybe even more advanced models where you're looking at other correlations and calculations on your historical data. You can go way down the rabbit hole here. I honestly have worked with teams in the past that did have people with doctorates, and they specialize in just trying to do forecasts that could go through and be extremely, extremely accurate with a whole bunch of different variables. It's a way you can do it, but I'll say that if you look at the 80-20 rule, you're going to spend a lot of time trying to get that last little bit of accuracy, a lot of time and a lot of money doing that. So sometimes maybe the first two methods here are a little bit better. Let's take a look at the short-term forecasting here, and let's jump into that middle model that we're looking at with the momentum. So like I said, a little bit beyond just your running averages to take just a little bit more of a look at your week over week jumps here. These sort of models, when you look at them and you're kind of staring at data or setting up your assembled account for the first time, it can be a little daunting, but really we're going to boil it down to kind of the simple parts here and use that to make a forecast going forward. So your first step here, let's break it down, is to just pick a number of historical weeks to look back at. 8 to 12 weeks, that's my rule of thumb. It's a good one to look back at. It does give you a lot of data to try to get some sort of trends to pull out of it. But having worked here at Assembled and going through some of this with our customers, there are some customers that just their volume is growing and changing so fast that we may only do like a 2 or 3 week look back. It reacts very quickly to changes, but you also don't get to, get those longer term trends. So somewhere between that 8 to 12 weeks is good. Try just a couple weeks if you do have that crazy fluctuation going through. As you're going through this, you're looking at the weekly growth pattern here. It's pretty simple. You're just going to look at the each week that you want to compare to the week before, minus and get the difference between those and divide it by the start week volume. So that might sound a little complicated in words here, but the formula is really simple. Just your end week volume minus your start week volume, you get the difference. Maybe it's 100 calls that's going up for the last week, divided by your start week volume, and you get a growth percentage there. You can do that back over those 8 to 12 weeks. And if you do have somewhat of a more stable business, you'll probably see that settle out where it's not 10% one week, then minus 3% another week, and then 7% the next. If you are seeing something like that, maybe a shorter time frame, or seeing if there are bits of the data that you can clean to kind of get a more stable forecast would be better here. So great. That's the simple way to look at your week over week volume, just being very methodical about how you go about that. However, now that you've got week over week volume, we've talked about this and how to be tactical and actually have a plan to work against. So let's take a look at how we are going to go in and get those hourly assumptions. Hourly here is going to be my stand-in for interval, but you can replace that with any time frame, maybe down to 15 minutes if that's what you use as well. So right before we jump into this, which is an arrival pattern, I'll just give another chance if there have been any questions that have come in, Shelton.
Would using the forecast accuracy and using the daily variance percentage be an acceptable method instead of manually calculating?
Yes, that would be. That is exactly the way that we suggest doing the tool. Our last couple slides, Valerie's actually going to go and show some screenshots of that. We're not going to hop in live because we don't want to mess with any data right there, but we will show that in the tool. I think one of the important parts that Val's going to cover too is if you go into those reports and you see there's some larger variances or things that look out of the ordinary, we have ways to go in and identify those and clean up that data so it doesn't give you some maybe forecasts that are outwardly influenced by those outliers. But we will touch on that at the end. And that's a good question to bring up. So arrival pattern, this is where you're going to take that weekly and you're going to get into something tactical. It's one thing to say, hey, I'm pretty certain that we're going to have 1,200 contacts next week up from our 1,100 this week. But that's great. Like, how are you actually going to staff against that? You people need to know when to come in, when to work here, things of that sort. So this is where you can look at an arrival pattern. This is something that actually happens behind the scenes. Assembled is doing this for you. But if you want to kind of do this yourself, or at least know how the process is being done, we'll take a look at it here. So the arrival pattern is just a volume agnostic representation of customer contact patterns in your business. I know I was being very boring by reading that directly off the slide there, and it's a lot of words, but I want to make sure that I said that right because it can be a little it takes a little bit to wrap your mind around sometimes when looking at this. So to break that down a little bit, it's just representing your weekly volume as percentages instead of those raw averages or raw volume for each interval. This is definitely useful for the queues that are going to have your week over week growth and your changes there. And then also ones where you kind of have a stable arrival pattern. If you have something where you're doing a lot of very like small micro sales promotions, something that's going to change your pattern, and it may have been Thursday of last week in the morning, and then it's going to be Tuesday of next week because the next thing is dropping, then this won't be as effective. But if you've got volume that's been coming in, kind of Mondays when people wake up, we get busy, it slows down by the end of the week, then this is where the arrival pattern is going to be super helpful for you. Let's look at calculating arrival patterns. Once again, this is a subject that you look at, and maybe when you just look at it, this can be kind of complicated to do, but really the math is super simple here. You're just going to take the entire week's worth of volume, and each hour, remember that's a stand-in for intervals. If you don't do it in hours and you do it in 15 minutes or 12-hour chunks, it doesn't matter. You're just looking at taking that and turning it into a percentage of the week. So you can see here, a representative example is just each one of these hours, instead of being the raw email contacts here, gets turned into that arrival pattern percentage of the week. Of course, this would mean that all of these percentages, they're very small because they're going to equal out to 100% over the entire week. This example here, when we made the larger one that we'll go into, you can do this maybe if you have a 24/7, you'll have very, very small percentages. If your company is only open and offering service Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, these percentages are going to be higher just because there's less hours to divide against. So please don't anchor off of these percentages. It's just a representation of what it could be. Another thing to point out here is there is kind of a next step, if you would like to go on this, where you can maybe make an arrival pattern for each day of the week. And Monday is 10%, Tuesday is 12%, and then have each hour be a percentage of those days. We're not going to cover it here, but it is another way to break down that volume if you really want to get into the details of it. So that was a lot of me talking about just how to do this and kind of what the theory is behind this. So let's take a look at how our favorite support person here, James Bond, would actually go ahead and tackle one of these problems. So the mission, which we are going to choose to accept, even though that's a different franchise, is to estimate the volume of calls that James is going to receive over the next 4 weeks. So let's go back to what we learned here. Your step one, James is going to go back and look at 8 to 12 weeks worth of volume. There is a lot of collateral damage that happens at MI6, so they know they get a lot of calls, and they kind of happen normally, when people are up and doing their business hours, Monday through Friday. So they're going to stick with 8 to 12 weeks for that pattern there. This, of course, will be used to get that weekly growth, and then also get your arrival patterns, and then finally turn that into a finished forecast here. So step two, you've got the data. We're on to the next part of the mission. We're just going to calculate the growth rate for those weeks. It's as simple as taking each week that we want to look back against. You can take maybe your last week, so the most recent one, figure out the growth percentage versus the week that just happened. Or if you want to take a little bit of a less precise approach, you can say maybe the previous 11 weeks, what was the average there versus that 12th week? And that's the growth pattern we're going to apply going forward. Either way, as long as you come up with a growth pattern that's probably not something like 50 or 100%, and that you're comfortable with, then we can move forward with that. So you got that growth pattern, you apply it for the next 4 weeks, and we're pretty close, but now we get on to that daunting arrival pattern. And remember, the arrival pattern is the percentage view of the weekly volume. And this actually gives you the ability to take that weekly volume and then just times it against that percentages. And it just saves you from having to do the work of maybe moving each hour or each interval individually if you didn't have the percentage pattern already in there. Plus, as an extra point that I didn't cover before, you can take a look at different weeks throughout the year. And when you put them into a percentage pattern, you can compare them on graphs. And it doesn't matter if you had 1 million calls versus 1,000 calls. You can take a look at the percentage patterns and see if it's people are calling the same way they have been, but now 1,000 times increase. It just gives you that extra ability to take away the absolute volumes from there. So James is almost through the mission, which is great because there's a lot of bad guys to get back out and go track down. So let's go through this arrival pattern here. Here is just a small slice of the hours, or maybe they work amazing hours, 9 to 3, Monday through Friday. That sounds like a great shift to me. So MI6 has some killer working hours here. James has done the work to turn this into percentages of the week so that there is an arrival pattern here. Hopefully this more expanded out example really helps drive home how it's turning that into the percentages and not the absolute values, which is what you want to work with. And now once James has this arrival pattern, we are almost home free here. The next step is to simply take those weekly totals that were calculated in step 2, and then the arrival pattern, you're gonna mix it all together, and you're gonna get your hourly, in this case hourly, volume forecast into the future out as many weeks as you want. If you've done that calculation growth for week over week and you want to apply it forward for 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 3 months, whatever it may be, and you keep the same arrival pattern, then you can apply that out as much as you want. I'll say the further out you get, maybe you want to put a caveat of this could be subject to change, so don't lock everything in, but it is good to have that view out there for a few months just to give people a chance to maybe start to plan against that. But we are almost home free now, and James Bond, of course, being the super spy that they are, makes sure to check their work and continually update the forecast and see the accuracy there.
We just got a question from Carly about whether or not this is something that we do manually, or does Assembled have this built in? And the great answer I have for you, Carly, is yes, Assembled has all of this built in and saves you the manual work in these aspects that I will be going over shortly.
Yep. People like myself, we love spreadsheets, but it does take a lot of time. So thankfully Assembled is doing this kind of behind the scenes. You can look at what is happening, as Val's going to go over with some of your outliers, but let the system do the hard part there. You got other things to do.
We also have another question from Ray, actually. Do you make any room for variances, such as issues that can come up at any given moment?
If these are variances of things that have happened in maybe your data to come up with your forecast, then this is where you go back and you'd clean that. We didn't really touch on that a lot, but if you went back through your last 8 weeks worth of volume and you knew that 2 Tuesdays ago, there was a huge outage. This happened at T-Mobile a lot, where you might have an entire market that has some sort of outage. You mark down those times and you kind of dump them out of your assumptions going forward, so that you don't have a spike in historicals carry forward as a spike into the future. So going back to our agenda here, we can see we've gone through kind of like a standard, like a normal week. But we got special events. We just went through some big ones, right? With the holidays, that's kind of on the top of everybody's mind. But they happen all the time, whether or not they are holidays, whether or not they are launches or anything of that sort. So let's take a look at special event forecasting and see what that looks like. We actually do have some additional content on this, because we did have some recorded sessions and some documents that went out before the holiday volume. So some of this may look a little familiar, but it is good to review what a special event can do. So simple, we'll break it down into a couple steps here. We're going to look at the last year's volume. This is looking at, if it's a holiday, ideally the same holiday if you have that type of volume. Sometimes you may have to pick holidays that you feel are similar. Then you've got your floating holidays and your holidays that land on the same time. So you want to go back and look at what you feel is going to be the best representation for your upcoming one, whether that's a day of the week or what you might assume for volume. You're going to look at contacts you received. Once again, was there a clear arrival pattern? We've talked about that in the future or in the past. So you're going to break that down into the arrival patterns. This is another reason why we do the percentages, because maybe last year when you're looking at this, your company's volume was 50% of what it is now. And it's really hard to take and say, oh, did it really have a bump? If I'm only seeing half the volume, you turn it into percentages and you can just kind of see that visually laid out if you graph those and say, oh, we did have a bump on Thursday. And I can see that in a percentage view just instead of the end result volume. The next one you want to do is go ahead and compare to your preceding days and weeks. This is very similar to what we were doing before, right? You're picking up, kind of what was the pattern going forward, what was the volume, what were we expecting, and then you're going to compare that to the weekly volume for the holiday. Or if it's just a single day, you might just do it just for that day. Sometimes this would be applicable for if you just have a very short or very small launch, and you would say, okay, what were the weeks leading up? Or maybe if I know it's just going to be Thursdays, what were my previous Thursdays leading up? What was that Thursday? How much bigger was it? Okay, it was 20% bigger. I will apply that going forward. So this is where you're going to work out a holiday multiplier. We call it the secret sauce. It's really not that secret, right? It's the volume received on the holiday. Once again, you divide that over the average volume received in the weeks prior. Please don't, it doesn't have to be exactly the weeks and how many you go back. It can be days, it can be hours, just depending on the time frame. You just want to make sure you're looking at the same size of time frame. There's your holiday multiplier. Maybe it's 25%, maybe it's 50%. And then you take and you adjust that part of your forecast going forward. So if you have, all right, we're going to have another product launch and it's going to be this coming week, and maybe it's just going to be on that Thursday, then you're going to take that holiday multiplier, that launch multiplier, whatever it may be. Let's say it was 25%, you apply it specifically to that Thursday. And maybe even if it doesn't happen at the start of the day, you might get a little bit more refined based off what you did in the previous steps and just apply it to the part of the day when it's going to happen. Maybe it's the last half of the day. So it's really taking the previous steps that we've done, but just looking for the outliers and using them in your forecast instead of maybe looking at the outliers and taking them out when in previous steps, we would have wanted more of a baseline view there. Cool, so how can I review the work? You're gonna see a similar trend here. We want to go and review our work, but we're talking about some topics here and we're just kind of mixing and matching, right? It's whether we're looking at 8 to 12 weeks of volume that we think is pretty stable and pretty representative of what we're going to expect going forward. And then applying that forward, it's are we looking at holidays or certain impacts, which are those kind of like maybe spiky volumes or more of the outliers, using that to forecast our outliers going forward. And then reviewing the work is basically just taking that and then looking back at what you actually did. So you're going to look at the actual volume and get that true multiplier. So in the example here, we're going to look at, a true holiday multiplier. And let's say for a launch that you planned for, you said, all right, last year it was a 25% raise for that launch. And I applied 25% to that day. Great. You went through that. Maybe the day was rough. Maybe you planned some PTO and were out of it because you were like, I've done the forecast. I don't want to deal with the madhouse that it's going to be that day. When you come back in, go back and do your future self a favor and get that holiday multiplier right away. Things are going to be fresh in your head, whether there were any sort of extenuating circumstances or things that are going to be hard to look back in a year when you're planning the next one and have to look at your historicals. So get your holiday multiplier, look and see if there's anything that was like out of the ordinary that you should consider, and then you can kind of just bank that away for next year and say, you know what, I thought it was going to be 25% over. It was actually 35% over, but it happened, maybe later on in the day or later on in the week than I thought. So I'm going to just kind of have this analysis already ready to go. And next year when it comes around, future me is going to thank past me for having already done this work and noted it and gotten it ready for the next time I have to forecast this out. And of course, that's part two that I was already touching on here is, beyond just looking at the data, dig in and see if there's things that like drove that to be a little bit different than what you expected. Was the overall day higher? Sometimes it's the overall day isn't higher, but your baseline volume has jumped up more than you expected. And then maybe the impact specifically from whatever was happening here was less. And those are things that I find are easier to go and check when you're maybe even during the event or right after the event, instead of a year later and trying to dig through data there. And then, one other thing to look at here is that you may notice that the event impacts they can be localized to a certain time, and sometimes they're not localized to a certain time. So let's, an event like the Super Bowl, basically all of the US kind of stops calling or getting sort of support at that time. And you can really say, all right, there was our Super Bowl dip in volume. But then for things like if you do a sale or around Thanksgiving, there may be the impact from the actual sale that holiday weekend, Cyber Monday and everything. But then you've got to consider if you're doing sales, returns, shipping, all of the rest of the logistics that can go on. And there might be those holiday hangover impacts that go on for the next week or so. So just things to look out for. Don't consider it may just be that one point in time. Some events are like that, and some just expand out further. I know we're touching on the kind of the holiday or the special event forecasting, but this holds true for your standard forecasting as well. Obviously, you want to pull in the most current week over week. If you're doing this as an ongoing weekly forecasting, then pull in what just happened on that last week, get your growth week over week again, get your interval week over week again. Assembled's going to do that for you on the back end, but it's a good habit to get in to just review and make sure that you were pretty accurate.
Katie just submitted. So does Assembled let you save any detailed info about a specific event or day? So when we're reviewing work and comparing historical numbers, we can easily see what happened that day, or would we need to note the details outside of Assembled?
Yes, we actually do have a number of reports that allows you to go back and see not only the forecasted volume for that particular day, but also the actuals volume. So we have the forecasted versus actual report, which allows you to do that detailed investigation in the past, as well as the forecast accuracy report. And we also will be sending out some follow-up links if you would like to speak with Adrian or our success team as well on some of the mechanics on how to do this within Assembled. So I'm happy to report to you all that Assembled has the amazing ability to do all this forecasting within the platform itself. So this will save all of you a ton of time in terms of doing this manual work and not only generating the forecasts, the arrival patterns and adjustments, but also being able to check your work with a number of tools and reporting that we have directly in the platform. And so more specifically, we have the ability to, one, generate queue and channel specific forecasts directly in the platform. And we do this by integrating with your contact platform directly. And I actually think Mike just alluded to this. I love how everyone is reading my mind here. This is a very seamless process, and it just saves you so much time because literally with 2 clicks on our integrations page, you are able to sync in your contact platform data directly within Assembled, and we actually go all the way back to the most historical data within your contact platform. We also have other options besides dynamically generating forecasts for you. Let's say, you already have an in-house forecasting team, or you have a data science team that already creates forecasts for the support team. You actually will also have the option to upload forecasts via CSV, or also use our API to put these forecasting data directly within the platform. And essentially using the forecasted number of contacts, as well as other variables that you specify, we can also generate headcount requirements for you. And we go quite granular in terms of those intervals for the headcount requirements, and we utilize Erlang C for live channels as well. We can go to the next slide, Adrian. We also have a forecast configuration section within the platform that allows you to add the adjustments or remove any outliers that might have happened in your business. And so this is highly useful for the section that Adrian touched upon regarding, those special events that might happen, whether it's adding, adjustments or a multiplier for the holidays, or also let's say, you had an outage that happened or something unexpected that essentially does not really mirror what your typical, arrival patterns look like. You have that ability to go in and remove that outlier directly within Assembled. All right, next slide, please, Adrian. And also we have a forecast accuracy report, and this allows you to verify the accuracy of your forecast with the actual volume over any time frame that you would like. Obviously, the lower the variance percentage you see, the better it is. This report is a great report to check on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. Back in my days in customer success, and I'm sure Shelton can attest to this as well, we highly encourage folks to go through that exercise of taking a look and seeing, okay, which outliers perhaps were present in the past week that we can remove, or how can we account for specific adjustments. It's a really good habit to get into to just make sure that, your forecast is spick and span. And, just even eyeballing this particular product screenshot, we see a nice outlier out here on the 22nd of February, and you have the ability to directly pinpoint that outlier and remove it in the adjustments panel that we just showed in the prior slide. And I actually see a question from Vinny, I believe, on how is throughput accounted for to define staffing? Once we forecast incoming volume, does Assembled match that to work output to define staffing needs? And the answer to that is yes, Vinny, we have the ability to essentially use that forecasted volume in the future and generate headcount and requirements around there for you to understand exactly how many folks you need within whichever channel you specify or queue you would specify. And we do this for approximately a few months out. So yes, you do have the ability to do that, as well as specify within our configured variables section, anything specific around handle time, concurrency, productivity, and other metrics that would essentially define the headcount requirements.
That's a great question. As we're talking here about the volume forecasting, there are the next steps. You can't staff against volume, you got to staff against requirement. And Assembled does that all in the back end for you too.
And I see that Tom has actually just put in another question about the last webinar on adherence, expecting to see a way for agents to clock in and out for lunch. How does Assembled know when an agent goes to lunch and or break and is back? So this is a great question, Tom. So the way adherence works in Assembled is we actually don't have specific clock in and clock out toggle functionality, and that is because we actually seamlessly integrate directly with your contact platform and the particular states that your contact platform provides. So I know customer, for instance, actually goes into a lot more granularity in terms of having those lunch states, meeting states, and other states for events that might be more in the clock in and clock out functionality. So while we don't do clocking in and clocking out, we actually just integrate directly with whichever state your agent is actually in within the platform, which we actually have found does lead to higher accuracy rather than having that manual toggle, which can sometimes be a bit distracting in general with an agent's workflow. Ooh, good question from Philip. And I think this is for you, Adrian. Is there ever a good reason to adjust your forecast after a week has already started? For example, in order to account for an unexpected feature release or similar incidents, I'm leaning towards just roll with it and to be sure to use it as an exercise for reflection after the week has passed.
Yes, great question. So yeah, if you do have something, I'm going to go back to personal experience that I had. So working at T-Mobile, the example I used before, sometimes like a market goes out, and this is going to date myself a little bit, when the Sidekick servers went down, that was a big deal. Everybody lost all their data. So it wasn't just like an isolated thing, and there is that time when you have to go in and take a look and say, hey, gonna have to blow up the plan and reforecast from there. Depending on what type of blow up to the plan you're expecting, you got a couple different paths to go with. One of them was, let's just say, hey, we think for whatever reason that we are still going to kind of see volume maybe in the same pattern going forward. So still, Tuesday night is our busy one, and then it dips down into Wednesday morning, but it's going to be more. Then you can take, this is where you will probably want to go in. It can be done in Assembled with some adjustments, but if it's intra-week, it may just be a little bit easier to do some of these on a spreadsheet if you've got to go really quick and do like just super fine ones that you're changing all the time without maybe making permanent changes to your forecast going forward. And you'll take and if you've got that arrival pattern, you can just kind of lift that up. So maybe you're already 2 days in and say, all right, let me just lift everything else up by 50% or whatever we think it's going to be. And then that you can use to say, do we need to collect, our overtime hours? Do we need to, if there's people on call them in? Do we need to pull that shrinkage? All the levers that you might have to try to get more people to bring to bear against that. And the second one is if not only is it increased volume, but it's kind of your arrival pattern is also going to be shot. So this is, that sometimes that immediate spike impact of, hey, the Sidekick servers went down. That's a little bit tougher because maybe if you have a historical event where you've kind of seen that snap change, and since we were checking our work before and kind of keeping those in our back pocket, maybe you've already got that in your toolbook to say, hey, last time we had this kind of outage, we saw it snap up for 4 hours because that's kind of what our engineering team takes to fix it. And it shot volume up by X%, then go ahead and maybe use that as the baseline for there. And then just keep, it's probably all hands on deck at that point. So you're going to keep checking to make sure, do we need to extend this out? Do we need to change from there? And then other times at that point, it may be a little bit of, it's going to be a wild ride. So let's do the best that we can to get through this. If it is just unprecedented times in our volume, make those micro changes as soon as we get some sort of indication, whether that's, engineering to resolution time, market address, if you do have that kind of data, if it is isolated to something, even if you have when markets or something may go to bed. So if a market's impacted, but then they are no longer, those people are going to be asleep, and kind of roll that into your forecast. There's a many different ways to look at that there, but reforecasting or adjusting on the fly is something that I would suggest doing. It's just figure out which is the best way it's going to work for you. Well, thanks everyone. I think we are going to have a recording out here of this in a little bit. We do have some additional information we can send out with we have the holiday information that we did last year. There's contact information for myself, for Valerie, for Shelton here. Val, did I forget anything else we are going to send out as a follow-up?
Yeah, I think you have covered it. So essentially just resources around some amazing articles that Adrian has spearheaded with Assembled University, along with contact info to chat with Adrian Shelton, as well as our sales team, if you think Assembled would be a great fit for your support team. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and be on the lookout for some of these follow-up items shortly.